Okay, well, hello everybody out there. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Chandra Legui. Even though it says Oregon Wild, I am the Western Oregon Field Coordinator for Oregon Wild based in Eugene. For those of you who might be new to Oregon Wild, we are a statewide conservation organization dedicated to protecting and restoring Oregon's wildlands, wildlife, and waters as an enduring legacy for Oregonians. Before we introduce tonight's webcast, I have just a few housekeeping items to go over. If your screen suddenly freezes or if the presenter slideshow disappears, just try closing out of your browser completely and then rejoin using the event link that you should have gotten in your email about an hour ago. We are recording tonight's webcast, so we will email you a link to the recorded video tomorrow. We'll also post the video to Oregon Wild's website so you can share it with your friends. You can enter questions at any time using the little question bubble, which is shown hopefully on your screen right now, a little tutorial. Those questions will go to me and my colleague Jamie, who's behind the scenes, and we'll compile them and see how many we can get to at the end. Try to submit your comments, or your questions rather, as we go along so that they're not all piled up at the end. Many of you bought tickets to our raffle, and we appreciate your support. The funds generated from our raffle not only help us put on presentations like this, but also help support other important conservation work. If you are the lucky winner, you'll get an email tomorrow morning. Instead of webcasts for the next couple of weeks, we would like to invite you to join us for our all virtual camp-inspired benefit called Call of the Wild, coming up on Friday, October 9th. This is our biggest and best celebration of the year to benefit our wildland, wildlife, and waters. 100% of the proceeds will fund our statewide conservation programs. We're also kicking off our online silent auction starting on October 1st, which is, believe it or not, next week. You can find out information and buy tickets at OregonWild.org. All right, so tonight's topic is essentially what caused, in a broad sense, the fires that we're all dealing with in Western and Southwestern Oregon that have impacted so many families, communities, and forests over the last couple of weeks. The firestorm that began on Labor Day will certainly go down in history, but what factors set them up for being historic? I want to start with extending my sincere feelings of sorrow, of grief, and of sympathy for all of those who have lost homes, possessions, family or friends, or have been evacuated and haven't been able to return home. Also, a big thank you to the first responders and the firefighters working really hard to get people to safety and to save structures, sometimes while their own homes burned. It's been an emotional week, a couple of weeks for everyone in the path of these fires, those with family and friends in harm's way, and really anyone who has ever visited the communities, the rivers, the forests, or the recreation sites that are affected by these fires. So I think we're all feeling a tremendous sense of loss, regardless of the severity of the impact to us personally. So I just would like to acknowledge that. And if you're like me, you've been consuming a lot of media surrounding the fires, seeking information, reading opinions, um, hearing different thoughts on their causes, and seeing a lot of fingers pointed at who and what are to blame. And so that's one reason we're aiming to keep this webcast focused on the facts and the science behind the circumstances of the fires, where the consensus really is that a combination of an extreme wind event coupled with extreme drought conditions help create a perfect storm. And I will let our panelists get into a lot more of that. Beyond this, though, I know that you are all probably have a lot of questions that go well beyond what we will be discussing on this evening's webcast. Just know that Oregon Wild and many other groups are working on some additional presentations that will be coming up that will cover more things like an analysis of what burned, fire policy, forest management, community preparedness measures, and what we all can do to help. So stay tuned for those. We won't get too into any of those issues tonight. So as you can see here on your screen, we have a couple of great panelists with us tonight. For this discussion, we have Dr. Ken Carloni, Erica Fleischman, and Tim Ingalsbee. Ken Carloni is a PhD botanist and forest ecologist who taught forest ecology, conservation biology, botany, and more for years at Umpqua Community College. He's based outside of Roseburg on the North Umpqua River and has been active with the group Umpqua Watersheds for many years. Dr. Erica Fleischman studied at Stanford and University of Nevada and currently teaches at Oregon State University, where she's also the director of the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute. Tim Ingalsbee is a PhD fire ecologist and head of FUSE, Firefighters United for Safety, Ethics, and Ecology, which he founded out of his experience as a wildland firefighter and as a forest activist. I will let the panelists each spend a few more minutes introducing themselves and offering up some initial thoughts on what factors contributed to our historic fires in just a few minutes. And then after that, we'll offer some discussion questions up to the panelists and have some good back and forth. And we'll leave time for about 15 minutes of questions at the end. First, though, I would like to offer we have a really great opportunity, actually, to see a special sneak peek of a forthcoming film that's right on topic for what we're talking about tonight. So with us to introduce a couple of clips is the film's executive producer, Ralph Bloomers. Ralph, can you just give a short introduction to the film, and then we'll roll about 5 minutes of some really relevant clips before we dive into things.
Thank you, Chandra. Thank you for putting this evening together, and I really appreciate your remarks. I know we all have friends in the path of the fire and friends that have lost homes, and it's really hard. And I know that we, really want to understand what happened. So I'm looking forward to the presentation. I would just say, in the wake of the Eagle Creek fire that burned through our beloved Columbia River Gorge, I set out into the air and into the ground, and with time-lapse photography and wildlife photography and with experts to sort of make sense of that fire, to document the regrowth and make some short films. And as a result of that, we were contacted by National Geographic and offered some funding to start on a feature film. And we traveled throughout the West and met with the top experts from home safety, climate, forest, fire ecology, firefighters, first responders. And we're nearly finished with a feature film about fire in the West, which is right on point with what has happened in Oregon. And tonight, we're just going to show you a few clips from that involve Dr. Lisa Ellsworth Johnson from Oregon State University, Dr. Chris Dunn from Oregon State University, Margot Robbins from the UROC, and they have sort of the initial narration, not the final narration, but hopefully those will help give you context for the wet forest that we live in and how they experienced this big fire event and sort of the larger context beyond our lifetimes, right? Because we're very aware of what's in our lifetimes, but these fires have been part of the Western landscape since the retreat of the ice sheets in the Pleistocene. And we've had large fire events before and largely climate influenced. So I hope you enjoy these. And if you feel that this is a film that you want to see now, it's possible if you reach out to me that you could get a private preview copy if you think there's some people that really need to see it right now. And then also I would just encourage you to go to Thriving with Fire or the social media presence of Green Oregon if you want to see some hopeful rebirth in the forest. Some of that, if you need some of that to sort of give you some hope for how our wild places recover after fire. Thank you.
Cool, thanks a lot, Ralph. So I'm gonna roll the clips and they'll take about 5 minutes.
In the 1920s, the mandate of the Forest Service became suppressing all wildfire as quickly as possible. And it's easy to understand why. It was an extremely hot, dry period. The 1930s brought an even drier period we know as the Dust Bowl, and lots of fire. Massive blazes prompted a ramp up of fire suppression, aided by surplus military equipment from World War II. But large fires still burnt homes and timber. Then something happened that confused our understanding of fire for generations. Ocean currents shifted and brought cooler, wetter conditions to the US, making fires far easier to fight.
We had these incremental wet periods during the summer. Incremental rains every week or two is just enough to tamp down fire behavior and support the fire managers to get out there and suppress those fires.
Fire suppression became extremely successful. Acres burned per year plummeted from 30 to 60 million to just 2 million by the 1960s.
That's where we started in the Western United States, really interacting with the landscape and developing our expectations on what the landscape could provide for us.
In the minds of baby boomers who grew up during the 1950s and 60s, fire was unlike hurricanes, tornadoes, or floods. It was an ecosystem function they could expect to control.
And that's the period of that great expansion. We see communities expanding. We see the land utilization expanding. We've expanded our recreation resources. We've expanded our water infrastructure. We've expanded our power infrastructure. And we've expanded our timber bases under the expectation that that's sustainable into the future.
And in the absence of fire, the balance of plants and animals changed. On the Yurok homeland, trees encroached on meadows that once supported elk.
I can just totally see the vision when this is pure prairie again. You can tell it's coming. I can almost see the elk here.
By the 1980s, the western US left that prolonged cool, wet period, and the number of acres burned per year began to rise. While climate change makes long, cool periods a distant memory, there are more people in nearly every landscape, creating more potential ignitions.
Well, now we'll get into the meat of our program. So I'd like to invite each of our panelists to introduce themselves, and they'll also share some perspective on what some of the key factors were that contributed to this month of fire activity. So you each have about 5 minutes, and I'm going to go ahead and start with Ken.
Okay, well, as Chandra mentioned, I did my graduate work, my master's work at the University of Connecticut in evolutionary ecology, and my PhD work at Oregon State University, where I studied the use of landscape fire by the Native Americans, the indigenous people in the area, and what we see now after, first of all, the extirpation of native fire management on the landscape, and then another 80 years of fire suppression, followed by another 50 years of industrial forestry, is a very different landscape than the ones that the settlers encountered when they first arrived. In our region, in southwestern Oregon, in the 1600-year fire history record that we were working with, we saw very little evidence of large fire. We could only reconstruct 5,000 to 7,000 acre fires, the largest. And in our area, what we saw was lots of small fires burning, pretty much every decade, even in stands that are considered to be moist forest, where the conventional wisdom is that they only burn every several hundred years. And what we do is we look at the cut trees. I have sort of a love-hate relationship with clear cuts because I hate to see the big old trees go down, but there's a lot of information in the stumps that are left over. And we can see as fires burn through, they'll damage a little bit of the cambium of the tree, and you can see the healing pattern of the fire scars in there. And so we can actually count back the number of years and see when those fires burned. And even in the moist forest, what we see are fires, very, very frequent fire return intervals, not so hot that they destroy the stand, but probably they're moving through, removing the small trees, removing the fuel, opening up the stands and encouraging the structural diversity, which supports the biological diversity that we see in our primary forests. And today, what we see is that when those forests are logged, they're replanted in even row, 10 by 10 rows of perfectly sized little trees, typically all the same species and all the same genotypes. And so as they grow up, those crowns remain very contiguous, very touching each other. And so when a fire does get into those stands, it tends to run right along the tops of those crowns. And typically in many of the fires, and I might get a chance to show you a graphic a little bit later in the talk, what we see is that after these fires have gone through the areas, that in many cases, the only green you see on the landscape are in the primary forests, even though they contain far more fuel. That is, they have lots more biomass. There's lots more stuff there to burn, but they tend to stay cool and moist. And so, the structure is very chaotic, very heterogeneous. And so the fires don't have a chance to go crown to crown to crown. And the other thing that we saw during historic times is lots of gaps in between the forests. There were lots of openings. Indians would burn out corridors and yards so they could travel across the landscape and maintain meadows that would bring in the game for them and create the food and the fiber and the medicine that they required for their life histories. And so we see a dramatic shift in the structure of our forests from those historic times through the Euro-American colonization, when trees could only be cut by human power and hauled by oxen. We didn't do a whole lot of wholesale damage to the forest there. But then industrial forestry, post-war, chainsaws, lots of roads, helicopter logging in places you couldn't get to, and so forth, have really dramatically changed the structure of our forests, therefore the structure of the fuels, and therefore the behavior of fires. But I don't want to, just one more second here, I don't want to minimize the aspect that climate is driving a lot of this. And so it's a complicated story. There's no simple answers, no simple solutions here.
Thank you, Ken. That's certainly probably going to be a theme with our talks tonight. So, Dr. Fleischmann, would you care to introduce yourself and try to answer that question from your perspective? What are some of the key factors that contributed to the fires blowing up this last couple of weeks?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I would be perfectly happy to just watch more clips from the film. But thank you very much. So I'm Erica Fleischman. My background is in ecology and conservation biology. I grew up in Maryland, and it's such a different environment in the West. Until I was 18, I didn't know that one could go hiking in summer. I would have thought you'd have to be absolutely crazy. And it's so stinking hot and humid that even the notion that a fire could start in summer if you try was ludicrous. So I've been in the Western United States for more than 30 years now, and have done a lot of research in the Great Basin and in California. So I'm more familiar with what's going on east of the Cascades in Oregon. But as you said, I am now the director of the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute. We were, or OCRI as we call ourselves for short, we were initiated by the Oregon State Legislature in 2007. So thank you very much, Oregon taxpayers, because you help support us. And what we try to do, we are housed at Oregon State University, but we are not a wholly owned subsidiary of Oregon State University. We pull together the expertise at Oregon's public universities, so the multiple OSU campuses, Portland State University, University of Oregon. We work with a lot of state and federal partners, NGOs, private organizations, and in general terms, we're charged with conducting research on climate variability and change and its effects on natural and human communities in Oregon. And a large part of our charge is also to do our best to communicate that information back to the legislature and to resource managers and to the public. It's already come up what the main factors were that likely contributed the most to the recent fires in Western Oregon, and those were climate change, the weather patterns that we had at the time, especially the winds, and patterns of human settlement. So long-term trends, and then some weather that, in terms of allowing an ignition to carry, was quite unfortunate. The evidence is quite strong that at this point, the majority, it depends exactly where you are in the country and in the Western United States, but many more fires are started by human activity than by lightning. That doesn't mean people going out and lighting fires intentionally. As the clips were showing us, there are a lot of fires due to power lines that are hitting vegetation. In some cases, fireworks use, there's always a spike in, truly there is a spike in wildfires right around the 4th of July. And any type of human activity. So the long-term coincidence of land use change and climate change is a major factor in a lot of what we're seeing. But the long-term trends in climate are contributing to not so much one particular fire, although it is possible in some ways to look at the extent to which climate change is changing the magnitude of extreme events. So one can't point to a fire or to a hurricane or to a flood and say climate change caused that. But the science is advancing in terms of being able to say that it's likely that climate change is making that hurricane or that flood 20% more severe, or making the sizes of the fires, the frequency of the fires more extreme. The projections, and these are, there's a lot of science behind these, a lot of scientific consensus, that in Oregon, although annual precipitation, total precipitation in a water year, is not projected to change in the coming decades, the timing of the precipitation is likely to change. So in general, it looks like there will be increases in winter precipitation and some decreases in summer precipitation. And that is contributing to an increased likelihood of the type of fires we're seeing. It also is likely that precipitation is going to become flashier. So think fewer larger storms, and that is more the case in Eastern Oregon than Western Oregon, but it is projected to occur in Western Oregon as well. And fire risk is likely to continue increasing over the coming decades, with some of the largest increases in the Willamette Valley and also in Eastern Oregon. So in terms of the subset of contributors that are climate change related, drought is generally what climate scientists and ecologists point to the most, because it's not so much, again, the loss of total amount of precipitation, but the amount of water that is available to plants. So you have vegetation becoming drier and fire being able to carry more readily. And sometimes I hear things like, 200,000 acres were destroyed. Not really true, as is going to come up a lot, but certainly, as you mentioned, the human communities suffer a lot, and so this is a major concern. And then there are the compounded factors of where are those people going to live, displacement in our country and worldwide from climate change. So thinking about how are those settlement patterns going to change in the future also. So thank you.
Wow, great intro to some deep issues. Thank you. Okay, Tim, how about you give your opening statement?
All right. Well, thank you for inviting me. And esteemed colleagues, it's really an honor to be here with you. My name is Timothy Ingalsbee, or Tim, and I'm Executive Director of Firefighters United for Safety, Ethics, and Ecology. And we do public education and policy advocacy promoting safe, ethical, ecological fire management. And we have a kind of different message about forest fire issues and a different kind of messenger, wildland firefighters and other people in the fire community. They say that the perfect firefighter is built from the neck down. We have a lot of smart and very wise, experienced people in wildland fire that say otherwise. In brief, I'm shocked but not surprised at this east wind firestorm event. And I share a special kind of grief because, you know, my folks in the fire community saw this coming and saw it coming well ahead. When Malden, Washington got incinerated, I mean, the media did report on that like news of the weird kind of thing, but they were a harbinger of what was coming. And it was like continental in scale, you know, the whole west side of the continent here. So I feel a certain amount of grief that somehow the fire management community was not able to convey that warning. There was an emergency coming. Crews were busy trying to secure the western edges of their fires, but they were just simply overwhelmed with the amount of fire, the amount of new ignitions happening, and an extremely rapid rate of spread. So I'll let Ken kind of focus on the forest management issues. That's definitely a key factor. You know, the fire exclusion and fire suppression in the past, the industrial logging, all that were factors. Erica, you know, focus on the climate. I'll kind of focus on the crews. And, you know, we've been at this for well over a month with the fires in California. And you know, that's been just enormous amount of activity and unstoppable fires. Well, we were kind of shorthanded here in Oregon. A lot of our crews are already there. And so there was not many people left behind minding the store. They've been in Colorado and California for weeks. But had we been fully staffed up, they would have been overwhelmed. This is a powerful force of nature. It's kind of a reality check on our human ability to conquer or control nature, and also a wake-up call to how we are impacting nature with climate change and stuff. So I was on Democracy Now! A while back, and Amy Goodman hit me with this thing. What about those helicopters in Afghanistan? Why aren't they here? Well, there were no helicopters or air tankers flying in that extreme windstorm. And that's the thing. In California, the heat wave was so intense, it was affecting the lift capacity of helicopters. The dense smoke that was blowing ground level, horizontal, there was nothing to see for air tankers. So it's a cautionary tale. Like let's invest in, you know, another air force to attack fires. That fleet was grounded when we needed it most. These extreme fire events are just, you know, you can't fight nature and expect to win in that kind of thing. So firefighters are just overwhelmed. The first crews here, like on a holiday farm fire, they were not even engaging the fire. They were emergency traffic control. They try to safely evacuate people. And that was the case on many fires. They're just, that's the first order, life safety, get people out because there was nothing to really to engage the fire. So I think it's a gut check. We put so much of our eggs in the basket of reactive firefighting. That will protect our communities. That'll stop wildfires. And that's, you know, we've thrown a lot of blood and treasure at that strategy. And it's time we shift that paradigm to get a little bit more proactive in preparing for fire. We know we can't prevent all fires, nor can we suppress all fires, but we must be prepared for all fires of whatever kind, whatever source. So fire preparation is really the call of the day. And then need to think holistically as well. It's all interconnected. The forests, the fuels, the climate, the homes we built in, that in many cases our homes are far more flammable than surrounding forests. And you know, the power grid we have, it's all we've got to holistically look at the big picture together. So that's all I have to say as a
Great, thank you, Tim. So Ken, well, I'm going to ask these next couple of questions of everybody, but kind of have a lead-off person in mind. So I'm going to start with Ken, and I wonder if you could start us off thinking about, and you talked about this a little bit already, but about how past management of forests have factored into how these fires behaved and continue to behave, and then if if you want to try to answer that for a couple of minutes, and then if Tim or Erica have something to weigh in on, that'd be great.
I think the last point that I made is that you know, fire is an interaction with lots of different forces, and that you know, we need to, as a colleague of mine that I was having a conversation with you know, via email the other day, said we need to separate the, you know, the ultimate cause from the proximate cause, and that is, you know, the ultimate cause here is that our forests are getting drier. You know, we're getting these crazy you know, weather-driven storms that we haven't seen before, but they are interacting with the fuel, and so the fuels have changed and the climate has changed, and we've got a mess on our hands that we still have to, you know, we don't have all, you know, we don't have the answers, and we don't have the data to create the answers yet. So I'm very anxious to see how this crazy, you know, climate-driven firestorm, climate fire, has affected the new fuel structure on the forest. And we can't, you know, you know, as Tim said, and others have said, we're not going to, you know, we're certainly not going to be able to log our way out of this. But there certainly are, you know, there's structural changes that we can make, starting close to people's homes, starting in the WUI, the wildland urban interface, and then moving out from there. And so you know, dealing with the backcountry can come later. Dealing with the forests that are right at our doorstep needs to start happening now. So I would, you know, I can stop there and let others kind of jump in and amplify that.
Yeah, Tim or Erica, you have something to add?
Sure, I think that's a great overview of what's going on. You're probably not going to get a whole lot of disagreement among any of us on these factors. I was thinking this morning about some of the calls for forest thinning or things like that, and thinking that, as has been said often, that is not going to be a solution. Many of these fires are burning in such a way, or in locations where it wouldn't make a difference. But thinking about what else the clearing does, trees don't levitate. So it's not possible to kind of just go and pluck them out the way you would pluck out a hair or something like that. There's still a lot of ground disturbance when one is, even if one is trying to be very selective and removal, all that, it still requires a lot of people, it still requires a lot of machinery. So these are trade-offs. There are still changes in the forest floor. There are things that people care about in these areas, and again, it's trade-offs. What does, even if one was to remove a lot of timber in the hope that, let's just give it a shot, let's say, as a hypothetical, what is that going to do to the structure of forests and woodlands? What are the trade-offs in those areas? Is the movement of some of the vehicles and humans going to increase sedimentation? I agree completely with Ken about the human imperatives about addressing the areas where the most immediate places where people live, but I think it's also worth thinking about the extent to which many people, given that they are alive and have a roof over their head, are relying on the backcountry. So we're relying on the water in these rivers for our drinking water and for other uses of water for agricultural systems. We're thinking about these areas for recreation, for resource extraction. That is a lot of the way that many people in Oregon are depending on these systems for their livelihood. So I think there are these trade-offs that hopefully will become more of a discussion of what does society want to try, and how are any of those things going to be addressed. I think I probably will we'll leave it there, and hopefully Tim also has some good comments.
Yeah, and I just wanted to note that I just put up a graphic that I think speaks to some of what we were just saying, that shows that, you know, the sort of thinning or fuels reduction efforts that's currently being done, you know, equals a pretty small fraction of what's actually out there in our forested landscape, and that the chances of fire encountering those treatments and not, you know, not being within a crazy drought windstorm are very, very small. And so considering the trade-offs with that, like you were saying, Erica, is a really important thing to do. Whether, is it going to make a difference, and are the impacts going to outweigh the benefits? Yeah. Tim, did you want to add anything else here?
I'll just add that in talking about the changes in the forest structure and fuels, most folks don't realize it, but fire really spreads. It carries through small diameter fine fuels. It doesn't leap tree trunk to tree trunk. It has to burn needles, limbs, generate enough heat. The vast majority of fires are surface fires. It takes a really rare event to have a big old growth forest on fire. But it does happen. It's kind of all or nothing, at least that's our models. But so part of the situation is excluding fires, suppressing all the fires that burned, under moderate conditions, especially in like California, in places where they, put out fires in the spring when it was kind of moderate weather and fuel conditions. Now they're desperately trying to fight fires in those same areas that are burning under extreme conditions. And just fires that burned last summer are kind of buffers and barriers to the fire spreads this summer. So there's nothing like fire to affect fire, and especially the real, the kinds of fuels that fuel and spread fire. And that's the issue today with climate change. Everything's drying out, and what dries out every day on a daily basis are those fine diameter surface fuels. And so they're just so receptive. The tiniest ember landing ignites a new fire, and that's what has really challenged fire crews. It's the extremely rapid rate of spread, where these fires, especially wind-driven, blowing embers mile ahead. It's hopscotching across the landscape, and they just can't outrace the head of the fire. So in that case, though, thank you, it's a map. In that case, though, fires hopscotching maybe from ridge to ridge to ridge, literally. Well, while the energy of the fire is moving forward, what's happening backward may be very different. Fires now may be creeping backwards into the wind, down from the top of a mountain, in a very low, intensity kind of scenario, even if it's extreme events. So these fires are growing so big, so fast, and they're still quite diverse in their effects. And we'll get to measure that soon. Get to observe that. But yeah, just it's taking out trees to address wildfire. Trump's got to have right. Make America rake again. Unfortunately, we don't have enough people in rates to get that fine diameter surface fuels. Fires are nature's tool for dealing with it.
And Tim, I put up this map that Fusey made and released today that shows the Holiday Farm fire, and in yellow you see the previously logged areas. So that's where you can kind of see the effects of the wind. Kind of, I think I heard you describe it as wicking up some of the drainages where there's a lot of fine fuel from logging operations. So that can definitely be a factor. Yeah. I'm gonna move to another question, one that I think has been at least as an old growth forest lover and an avid hiker, I've been wondering about the fate of some of the forests that I love, like Opal Creek and some of the forests on the Mackenzie. And it's still too soon to know much about the fire severity or how these places are being impacted or have been impacted, how severely they burned, what sort of mosaic pattern we're looking at in the natural forests. I know that Ralph, who was with us earlier, is planning to go up in a plane and take a look at some of that pattern on the landscape, and others will be doing that soon and looking into an analysis. Right now, what I've heard is some of the old growth forests that I so dearly love have burned in a mosaic pattern, as you might expect for a forest that has a more natural fuel structure, if you will, as Ken said, and forests that have evolved with fire over millennia. We know that it's a natural part of these forested landscapes, but we also know, as we've been discussing, that conditions have changed a lot. The forest landscape and the makeup has changed, and where we live has changed, and climate change has changed. So Erica, I wonder if you could maybe address what you think we might expect from fires in Oregon in an era of continued and increased climate change impacts.
Yeah, we can expect more fires. Unfortunately, larger fires, perhaps hotter fires, likely more frequent fires. Of course, as Tim said, to some extent, as fires become more frequent, they also, in a general sense, tend to become less severe because there's less buildup. At least less severe ecologically. I think, again, as people have been bringing up, the effects on people are likely going to be greater, in part because there are more people. And right now there's more inequality. And so there are people that are less able to move, less able to rebuild. So there certainly are some things going on there. I think it's also worth bringing up, maybe you didn't intend to do this, but I'll take my opening. You asked in Oregon, not just in Western Oregon. And in Eastern Oregon, Tim gave me a great opening to talk about the plant I most love to hate, which is cheatgrass. Cheatgrass is an invasive brome. It's a non-native plant that is widespread across the Intermountain West, and it is extraordinarily flammable. So cheatgrass does very well whenever there's any type of ground disturbance, and that can be fire, it can be blading along roadsides, paradoxically, to try to reduce the likelihood of fire along the roadsides. It can be from livestock grazing, but this is a bad plant. No one likes this plant. And it is really changing fire dynamics in the high deserts. So fires are becoming larger and more frequent, and they carry extraordinarily quickly. And when cheatgrass comes in, it tends to form a monoculture where it's gone through. So there are hundreds of thousands of, probably millions of acres across the West that are now cheatgrass dominated. Cheatgrass also responds very well to winter precipitation. And as I mentioned, a lot of the projections are suggesting that there will be more winter precipitation. So some of the places that I know and love best, I'm concerned about the transformation there and what it's going to mean for transformation of those systems. But it's again, what can we do? And I know that people have been talking about this. What can we do with people? What can we do with the systems? These systems will come back. They may come back differently. There are many stressors. So the trees, the areas that are more forest, and the areas that are have historically, at least over our lifetimes, been quite a bit wetter. The trees are also, they're becoming climate stressed, and then they're more prone to other types of stresses, just like people, when they have respiratory ailments, are more likely to suffer from COVID or things like that. So as trees become climate stressed, as there's less water, they're more likely to be killed by beetles or to be susceptible to pathogens. So there are some changes of the standing trees. They are also becoming drier and less able to resist some of the fires or to recover from some of the fires. I don't mean this to be all gloom and doom. I mean, these systems will come back, but it's a matter of how do they come back, and do they come back in ways that are consistent with society's expectations for them?
Yeah, that's a good question to tackle another time too. Well, I actually do want to pivot to get away from some of the doom and gloom, and to start thinking about what we might do before we run out of time, because I want to give all of you a chance to talk about this, and then see if we can get to a few questions. We might go a few minutes over. So, Tim, you brought up the idea of preparing to live, with fire, preparing for more fire. And I know that's a lot of what you deal with at Fusey. So could you kick us off to talk maybe about some things that we might do to prepare for a future with, probably, as Erica just said, more fires that not only impact our forests in the backcountry, but also the homes and communities, like we just saw in the last couple of weeks. I mean, the fires in Talent and Phoenix didn't have anything to do with forests, but what could communities do to better prepare themselves?
Yeah, thank you, Chandra. I think, well, let's deal with what is probably at the greatest risk and our highest value. And these issues like climate change, that's going to be many, many generations solving that, okay? changes in the landscape, millions and millions of acres. Again, a big problem. All this development scattered all over the landscape, 90 million people all over the state of California, and it's all fire prone. Big problems, long time scales. Where do you begin? Well, we begin right at our homes because those are most vulnerable. Again, many homes are more flammable than the surrounding trees. And you'll see that again and again and again in these disaster films of mounds of ash where homes once stood and big tall green trees standing right overhead. It's even up the Mackenzie Valley, that will be the scene. So start with our homes and make them, you know, reduce their ignitability. And it's relatively simple things. We have the tools, technology, know-how to do that right away in a matter of a few short years. We just lack the will and the focus. We're still trying to, you know, manage the earth, and you know, we're kind of neglecting our homes. So that's where we should start. And the sooner that people feel safe in their homes and their communities, that's going to expand our options for how we manage fire on the wider landscape and how we're going to deal with that. So it all starts at the homes, and firefighters really depend like on a partnership with rural residents preparing their homes. As we learn now, though, it's not just a rural thing. We're all living in the fire zone. Even those beyond the reach of flames are getting it with the smoke. So communities got to plan to prepare as a community, not just an individual thing. Evacuation routes that lead to safety zones in the community. You know, here in Eugene, all the highways were severed during the emergency. Shelters from the smoke and the flames. Rooftop solar. I mean, retooled it power grid. There was, to the best of my knowledge, we never had a wildfire ignited by rooftop solar panel. But what is an annual crisis in California has come to Oregon, and probably that fire in Goshen is a huge substation. Who knows what that's about? That's happening. So anyway, start with the communities we work out. But ultimately, our vision is we were looking for fire compatible communities able to live safely and sustainable with a fire permeable landscape and in fire adapted ecosystems. And that's where and it all starts at home.
And Tim, I think you used the term in the first, your first couple of sentences about, well, actually now I've lost it, but I guess, you know, are you talking about, when you're talking about fire management, are you talking about things like prescribed fire and doing more of that?
Well, prescribed fire or managing wildfires that already occur. You know, I want to give it up to my colleagues here, but if we want to talk about what's happened in Opal Creek Wilderness with the Beachy Creek fire, I'm ready to talk about that.
I don't know if we're gonna have time,
Yeah.
but maybe we'll get to questions. Ken or Erica, would you like to weigh in on, you know, what we could do to prepare for living with potentially more fires in this era of climate change?
Let's get to your questions.
Yeah, I just might jump in and say that part of reconfiguring simplified forest structures is not only going to help with resiliency on, you know, ground fire, sort of what used to be normal fires coming through, but there's another reason to do that, and that is by reconfiguring those forests. And again, I want to emphasize that, you know, we need to start in the areas around people's homes. We know that it's not going to work every time. We've seen images of Paradise, California, with thinned forests and buffers and a burnt neighborhood. So these 60-mile-an-hour, you know, wind-driven fires, you know, all bets are off. But not every fire is going to be that. And so, you know, preparing for that as we move away from populated areas. You know, I understand the resistance of going, you know, farther out into the backcountry to reconfigure those stands. But the old growth stands that we still have on the landscape are important reservoirs of carbon out there and important reservoirs of biodiversity. And so by reconfiguring the stands, you know, farther out in the backcountry, you know, will help us protect those stands as well. And those are values to society as well. Right now, our focus is very much on our friends and neighbors who have, really are suffering, and that's where it should be. But but going forward, and as we get a handle on the WUIs and do the best we can, there are other ecological reasons to reconfigure those stands in terms of biodiversity and in terms of protecting these giant stores of carbon that we already have out there on the landscape in these primary forests.
Yeah, good point. Our forests, even burn forests, are incredible carbon reservoirs.
Yeah, and I was also going to say, Chandra, people who have seen Chandra's book know she's an excellent photographer. And so when you go back out to your favorite, old growth forest, bring your close-up lens instead of your wide-angle lens, because it's going to be loaded with wildflowers. You're going to see biodiversity on the forest floor like you haven't seen, and I've seen it over and over again with these fires that burn through. And you look at this beautiful big old tree that bit it, and then you look down on the ground and you see 10 species of wildflowers that you hadn't seen last time you hiked there.
Yeah, I love burned landscapes, and that'll be a topic for a completely different, nature nerd podcast or webcast. But I want to get to a couple of questions, and I think I'll start with you on this one, Erica, because you might know. Someone's asking, how do the recent fires compare with the Tillamook burn from the 1930s as far as size and maybe contributing factors? And maybe I'm not sure if you're the best person to answer that, but hopefully.
I'm going to have to confess that I'm not the best person to answer that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any of the others?
Tillamook fire was 4 fires, by the way, and the first one was ignited by logging operation, quasi illegal one at that. During a very high fire danger period, they were out there trying to get the cutouts. So, with over 80% of ignitions caused by humans or infrastructure for humans, there's one thing we can get a handle on.
I think what I saw was that in the last 2 weeks, we've had almost about 1 million acres burn in Western Oregon, and I think the Tillamook fires were in the like 200,000 range, something like that, or even smaller. Yeah. Still very significant at the time. Can one of you address how much we're looking at carbon emissions from fire? I know a little bit about this, but I think it's a good question to address.
One of the things about fire is when you calculate how much carbon you send into the atmosphere after a fire. Some folks at OSU have done calculations afterwards, and it turns out that within 3 years after the fire, an enormous amount of that carbon gets pulled back down out of the atmosphere in this compensatory response that happens after the fire, because you get, the trees that survive flush, a lot of the stump sprouters go crazy, all the wildflowers bloom. So there's a lot more carbon that gets captured after the fire, and a lot of the calculations, especially from folks who make their living from trees, is that they'll say, oh, look at, and they don't continue looking at how much carbon comes back into the ecosystem from that post-fire green up that happens.
It's a bit of a question of, are you thinking about a local carbon flux, or are you thinking about globally? And so locally, there are those, okay, how much is stored in the older trees, or is going to be absorbed by new growth or something like that. If you look at it globally, it's not a major factor, just given that what feels very, very large when you're living in the middle of it is actually pretty small when you look at the forested area across the country or the forested area across the world. So these fires are not a major player in terms of global carbon fluxes. Now, that doesn't mean that fires around the world are not a major player. When you start looking at extensive fires, many of which are intentionally ignited in parts of the world that are being deforested because people are trying to earn a living, it's a different thing. But these fires in Oregon are not likely to have an effect on global carbon dynamics.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of I mean, these huge smoke plumes, they look scary and looks like, oh, that's all carbon. A lot of it's water vapor, which is kind of a greenhouse gas too, but very short term. But we make a distinction between the living carbon in the ecosphere, of which there's an exchange, like inhaling and exhale. Normally trees exhale oxygen, right? Well, in a fire, they temporarily exhale carbon, all right? But they'll inhale it back. It's different from the carbon we're exhuming from the lithosphere. That's dead carbon. And that's what we're pumping up in the atmosphere. And so the real burning issue of our time is fossil fuels emissions. That's the real ultimate source, and this proximate source, if you will, of living carbon that is being just cycled through the ecosphere. That's a real minor part of the real crisis.
Great point. Yeah, we hadn't touched on that yet as far as climate change, but yeah, we definitely need to be addressing that. You know, I've got some pretty sophisticated questions in the long list here about whether we should be using prescribed fire, managed fire, close to communities as a way to address, you know, help communities be better prepared, and then also some questions about tribal use of fire, using, you know, their traditional knowledge and management. So again, that's probably a whole other webcast, but if anyone wants to address that a little bit more than what we have already done, that would be great.
I would say it's a risk calculation. I'm not in the position of fighting these fires, so I can't speak to the trade-offs in terms of the human risk, but prescribed fires, I mean, if there are areas where it makes a lot of sense to somehow reduce the fuels in close proximity to structures, prescribed fires, society gets to pick the circumstances under which they're ignited and do it under circumstances that are as unlikely as possible to blow big. It's gonna happen sometimes, but there's that trade-off of, do you want it under circumstances where it is as controllable as possible, where you have people there that can try to suppress it, and where the conditions are amenable to suppression if there's an escape, or do you want it under situations that are totally outside your control? And that's a hard thing when it's easy for me to say because it's not being done next to my house, and I understand that, but those are the types of trade-offs. It is difficult in terms of the implementing prescribed fire. There are a lot of air quality regulations. There are a lot of things beyond just desire that complicate the ability to implement prescribed fire in various areas. Those also can be changed if society decides to, but it's not simply a matter right now of, gosh, well, if this community wants it, we can do it. There are a lot of things to navigate. And in the backcountry, restrictions on potential archaeological sites, things like that. So it's more complicated than just, do we want to do it? But
yeah, not a one size all fits all approach either, right? Different forest types might not be appropriate.
There is an emerging solution that I think would work very well in you know, close into communities, and that is I and a number of my colleagues have been working on landscape level biochar projects where we're keeping the fire in a metal box. And so we're going in, right now we're working on a oak restoration project where we're thinning conifers out from around these ancient oak trees to save them in the absence of landscape fire. And we're leaving the larger diameter 4 inches and above on the forest floor as an ecosystem resource. And then we're taking the smaller material, putting them into mobile flame cap kilns that we use in the field to not only treat the fuel, but to capture 30 to 40% of that carbon as biochar, which is a form that the microbes can't attack and can't break down. And the analyses are that centuries to millennia, that carbon is going to stay in the soil. So we're making the direct equivalent of fossil fuel and we're putting back in the ground. Now it's labor intensive, but if you're in close to urban areas, I would say that, you know, that's a promising new technology, very simple, very little expense to get into that business. A lot of labor already knows how to handle a chainsaw and swamp slash out into a kiln. So, my recommendation would be, within that danger zone around the WUIs, we can still burn, but we do it in a very controlled way in metal kilns that we move around the field. Save the landscape fire, for the backcountry.
That's an interesting approach. Yeah.
That's very exciting. That is very exciting. And I'll just say briefly, because of all the constraints on prescribed burning that Erica mentioned, I mean, that's the ideal form of fire to a fire manager. Best chance of controlling its behavior, best chance of reaching your desired effects. So many social, legal, financial constraints that limit that tool. What the future is managing wildfires like a prescribed fire, because sometimes we get ignitions in the conditions that are just ideal for a prescribed fire, and it is so managing a wildfire with already pre-planned plans. We play computer games in the winter. We game out scenarios, given the mission and all these conditions. So that's the future, is managing it, very holistic, blurring the distinction between a prescribed fire and a wildfire becomes ecological fire use during a wildland fire.
Interesting. All right. This one, I'm just going to get to one or two more, and then we should wrap up and respect everyone's time. But a question, there's a lot of proposals out there at both the state and federal level that have been, thrown out as potential solutions for addressing fire and fuels reduction. I guess the question is, should we throw out the idea of doing things like thinning further out into the forest away from homes and communities? That is pretty costly, and again might not have that risk reward balance, or should it still be in the mix because it has value in some places? And it's, I know, kind of complicated, but maybe we can see if any of you want to answer that.
Well, I think you probably know what my answer is, and I know there's a certain amount of pushback because people are concerned that money is going to be spent in the wrong place. That money is going to be spent in the backcountry when it needs to be spent at the WUIs. It needs to be spent on strengthening building codes. It needs to be spent on incentives for people to build their house in a more fire safe way.
And for the record, not all of that costs money. Some of those things don't really cost money. It's a matter of changing policy.
Right. Yeah. Certainly. And so I'm fully prepared to get criticism on on my interest in working in the backcountry. And I'm not saying I'll say this for the third or fourth time. The money needs to be spent now protecting people's properties and lives. But I don't want us to lose the idea that we have tremendous stores of carbon out there that we can help protect, at least to some extent, by reconfiguring the stands around them to keep fire on the ground in those stands. We get the value of getting some logs to the mill. We have the value of creating the structural diversity that reinforces biotic diversity. And we have hopefully the advantage, at least in some of our fires, of dropping those fires onto the ground before they hit those old growth stands and maintaining those huge stores of carbon for as long as we can on the landscape.
So part of the mix.
Part of the mix.
Yeah. Tim or Erica?
I certainly am aware and very sensitive to many folks in the forest conservation community who are just veterans of the timber wars and have no trust for federal land management agencies, for all the abuses of the past. Just keep them out of the forest, okay? But I'm colored by my own experience of working, in those agencies and doing good work. And I'm also very sensitive, aware of indigenous people's legacy of living with the land, not off the land. And so somehow we're going to, it's a wider cultural revolution we need, that we see a human component of ecosystems. we're part of that system and part of nature, not apart from nature, and that our hands and our heads and our hearts are also part of that system. And so it's not like doing work in the backcountry is an intervention in nature, but more of an interaction with nature. And I look forward to that day. I hope my children will have that world to live in, because I love working in the woods.
All right,
It's
any
all,
last words? Yeah, go ahead. Okay. Well, one last thing before I let you all go, and that is, Tim, you teased us with saying you were prepared to talk about what's going on in Opal Creek, and since I brought it up, and someone actually else prompted me to say, please talk about that. If you have just a brief update about news from there, please
I
fill us
don't
in.
have news. I have
Okay.
wild speculation only, so I'll keep that for a later date. But I know people are grieving about the forest as well, their homes and communities, dear friends, tragedies. But I don't assume that tragedy pertains to the entire landscape or the old growth forest. You know, I mean, most of the primary forests in Western Oregon were born in the last big fire. Okay, so you know. So I'll keep that wild speculation for a later date.
That's a good hopeful end there. All right, Ken or Erica, do you have any last words before we go?
Just to thank you. I've really enjoyed interacting with all of you. I've learned some things, and wish the circumstances were different. We could be sitting down and having a drink and talking some more. But thank you, Chandra, and your colleagues for hosting us and for this opportunity.
Awesome. Thank you. Ken, anything?
I guess I would just end by saying that, you know, I hope we can get to a point as a community where we're not pointing fingers and blaming each other for this, and that we're all trying to do the right thing. We're all trying to work together with our communities. We're all trying to make everybody whole in one way or another. And that I truly believe there are ways to do all that. That you know, people can have meaningful work in the woods. People can have safe communities. We can have lots of little fires and lots of little solutions to big problems.
Nice.
I wholeheartedly agree. And, you know, again, you know, this webcast was meant to be, you know, exploring some of what led to the fires that we're dealing with right now. We have talked a bit about, you know, solutions and things moving forward, but I think there will be many more discussions about that as we move forward, and maybe I'll see some of you back to have those discussions. But thank you all for joining us and offering your really wonderful perspectives on this really complicated topic. Thank you, all of you out there who have been tuned in, and again, stay tuned for more discussions like this. So good night.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It was really fun.
Yep.